Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
consent the call to quorum be terminated?
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations: calendar number 44, 144, 189, 303, 334, 356, 358, 359, 361, 362, 367, 371, 372, 378, 379, 380, 387, 388, 390, 391, 403, 404, 406, 407, 408, 409, 410, 412, 413, 414, 415, 416, 417, 418, 420, 422, 423, 424, 425, 426, 427, 428, 429, 430, 431, 432, 433, 438, 439, 440, 441, 442, 443, 444, 445, 446, 447, 448, 449, 450, 451, 452, that the nominations be confirmed in block. The motion be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate. That no further nomination be in order to any of the nominations, that any related statements be printed in the record, and that President Obama be immediately notified of Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to...
Senator from Tennessee.
And I will make my remarks on this matter after the majority leader has completed his business today. But I would note that on the last day we were here, November 21st, there were only 16 nominations on the executive calendar who'd been there more than 3 weeks, only 8 more than 9 weeks. The Republicans were ready to confirm more than 40 who had been there just a few weeks. And the Democratic majority changed the rules of the Senate in a way that creates a Senate without rules. And so until I understand better how a United States senator is supposed to operate in a Senate without rules, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President, I'm not going to respond in any detail to my friend, and he is my friend. There is no way of explaining how the Republicans could arbitrarily refuse to nominate 3 of the most qualified people, in fact 4, frankly, because they turned down 1 woman twice for the D.C. Circuit. This is, some say, a court more important than the United States Supreme Court. And the Republicans, without any question about their integrity, their education, their experience, said no. Why? Because they don't want President Obama to have these people in this important court. They want to keep the court with a majority of Republicans. That is wrong. It's wrong. And there were many reasons that we did what we did, but it was the right thing for the country. It's a right thing for democracy. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to executive session to consider nominations calendar number 330, 347, 348, 349, 350, 382, 383, 384, 385, 386, 434, 435, 436, and 437, that the nominations be confirmed. Motion be considered made and laid on the table with no ordinary action or debate, that no further motion be in order in any of the nominations. Any statements related to the nomination be printed in the record, that President Obama be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Is there objection?
Madam President, reserving
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President. Reserving the right to object, and again, I'll make my comments after the majority leader has completed his business. But all Senate Republicans wanted with the D.C. Circuit judges was to do what Democratic senators insisted on doing in 2006, which is transferring judges from a court where they're not needed to courts where they are needed. I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, that explanation is as flat as a bottle of beer that's been open for 6 months. Okay, Madam President, I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 378.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion is agreed to. And the clerk will report the nominations.
Nomination, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Chai Rachel Feldblum of the District of Columbia to be a member of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Chai Rachel Feldblum of the District of Columbia to be a member of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, signed by 19 senators as follows.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that reading the names not be necessary tonight.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I now move to proceed to executive session and consider calendar number 330.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nominations.
The judiciary, Elizabeth A. Wolford of New York to be United States District Judge for the Western District of New York.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Elizabeth A. Wolford of New York to be United States District Judge for the Western District of New York, signed by 19 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent that reading the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I now move to executive session to consider calendar number 347.
Without objection. Now the question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Landria B. McCafferty of New Hampshire to be United States District Judge for the District of New Hampshire.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Landria B. McCafferty of New Hampshire to be United States District Judge for the District of New Hampshire, signed by 19 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent that reading the names be waived.
Without objection.
I now move, Madam President, to legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I now move to proceed to executive session to consider count number 361.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, Patricia M. Wald of the District of Columbia to be a member.
I've done the first one and this one, they would be out of order. I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Patricia M. Wald of the District of Columbia to be a member of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, signed by 19 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent that reading the names be not necessary.
Without objection.
I now move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I now move to executive session to consider count number 348.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. And the clerk will report the nomination.
The Judiciary, Brian Morris of Montana, to be United States District Judge for the District of Montana.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Brian Morris of Montana to be United States District Judge for the District of Montana, signed by 19 senators as
The reading of
follows.
the names be waived, Madam President.
Without objection.
I now move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I now move to proceed to executive session and consider count number 349.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
The Judiciary, Susan P. Waters of Montana to be United States District Judge for the District of Montana.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Susan P. Waters of Montana to be United States District Judge for the District of Montana, signed by 19 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I now move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I now move to proceed to executive session to consider count number 358.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Department of Defense, Deborah Lee James of Virginia to be Secretary of the Air Force.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Deborah Lee James of Virginia to be Secretary of the Air Force, signed by 19 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I now move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I now move to proceed to executive session to consider count number 444.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Department of State, Heather Ann Higginbottom of the District of Columbia to be Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Heather Ann Higginbottom of the District of Columbia to be Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources, signed by 19 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I now move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I now move to proceed to executive session to consider count number 406.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Ann W. Patterson of Virginia, a career member of the Senior Foreign Service Class of Career Ambassador to be an Assistant Secretary of State.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Ann W. Patterson of Virginia, a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, Class of Career Ambassador, to be an Assistant Secretary of State, Near Eastern Affairs, signed by 18 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I now move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I now move to proceed to executive session and consider calendar number 450.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Department of Homeland Security, J. Charles Johnson of New Jersey to be Secretary of Homeland Security.
Senate cloture motion at the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of J. Charles Johnson of New Jersey to be Secretary of Homeland Security, signed by 18 senators as follows.
Unanimous consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
Unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business day, it adjourn until 10 a.m. on Tuesday, December 10th, and that following the prayer and the pledge of the morning hour be deemed expired. Journal of proceedings be approved to date. Time for 2 leaders be reserved for use later in the day. And that following the day remarks, Senate proceed to executive session to consider the Millet nomination under the previous order.
Without objection.
Senators then should expect the first vote tomorrow at approximately 10:15 a.m. If there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it adjourn under the previous order following the remarks of approximately a half an hour of Senator Lamar Alexander.
Madam President,
Senator from Tennessee.
I wonder if I might ask the Majority Leader a question.
Of course.
Madam President, if I may ask it through the chair, as I understand it, there are a total of 14 district judges on the calendar and that the Majority Leader is the only one in the chamber who has the right to bring a judge from the calendar to the floor. If I heard him correctly, he has asked for 4 district judges. He's filed cloture on 4 district judges. The way I understand the Senate procedure is that means we have an intervening day tomorrow and we can start voting on Wednesday. Because we changed the rules at the Majority Leader's request to make it easier to confirm district judges, there's only in effect 1 hour of debate on each district judge, or 2 hours equally divided, and if the Democrats decided that they didn't want to use their hour, we could use our hour if we wanted to. And that there never has been in the history of the United States Senate a district judge denied his or her seat by a filibuster, not to President Obama, not to anyone else. So, if that's the case, why does the Majority Leader not bring all the district judges up? Let's bring all 14 of them up, bring them to the floor, have 1 hour of debate on each one. Why don't we do that?
You tried to do that. The distinguished senator from Tennessee objected. Madam President, the truth is that the Senate's gotten out of whack. If there was a controversy with one of these judges, then you could have some reason to stall it. In years past, we've just done it by unanimous consent. Now, I think it's unfortunate that this Senate has come to that, but that's where we are. Now, we could approve 14 of these by my friend not objecting to them. He said, he's on the record as saying that he doesn't think that there should be judges who are objected to, district court judges, shouldn't be filibustered. But, you know, here's the situation. During the entire time we've been a country, there have been 23 district court judges filibustered. Entire time we've been a country. 20 of them been during the Obama administration. So this is a game that the Republicans have played to do everything they can to make Obama a failed president. And they are not doing that. He's a very successful president. He has a long list of things he's done in spite of the Republicans. So I don't know the point that my friend is trying to make, but let's prove all these. They're all going to get approved anyway. So what we're going to do is go through this process. Remember, I saw him, I don't know if he's still here. Yeah, no, he's not here. I saw my friend, the senator from Arkansas, come through here. He helped along with the senators whose idea it was from Tennessee, because Senator Frist was the leader. He backed off that, and I understand why. When we had this nuclear option came up before, the constitutional option. And there was an agreement made by my Republican colleagues that they would not filibuster a judge unless there were extraordinary circumstances. Does anyone understand? Does anyone not understand why the whole country is upset about this? Extraordinary circumstances? Look at these circuit court judges. It is outrageous that they don't like them just because they don't like them. Their qualifications are superb. Their educational backgrounds, the best law schools in America they went to. They all have good work records, but they have objected to them. So, you know, Madam President, my friend, who I have great admiration for, senior senator from the state of Tennessee, he has a stellar record. He's been governor of the state. He's been a cabinet secretary. And he's been a very fine senator. But in his heart, he knows what's going on here in the Senate has been wrong. And he may criticize the majority leader for working to change the rules here. But, Madam President, they've been changed before. They're going to be changed again. It simply is not working. And who can complain about majority vote? Who can complain about that? Someone talks about this filibuster if it's something that's engraven someplace along with the Ten Commandments. But it's not. It's not in the Constitution. It's something we've developed here in the Senate for rules. It originally came about to help get legislation passed. But my friends, the Republicans, the last number of years have used it to defeat legislation. So these nominations should have been approved. We shouldn't have to go through all this, and we won't have to in the future.
Madam President.
Senator from Tennessee.
I appreciate the courtesy of the majority leader in allowing me to ask him a question, and I have more to say about this whole subject. But let me go back to my point. There are 13 district judges on the calendar. On November 21st, when we last met, there are 13 district judges. There's only one person in this chamber who can bring a judge from the calendar to the floor for confirmation. That is the majority leader. Why did he not bring them all up? Why didn't he move them? Because under our rules, all he has to do is make a motion that so-and-so district judge be confirmed. We have to wait one day, and then we have 1 hour of debate, and never in the history of the country, according to the Congressional Research Service, has a district judge been denied his or her seat because of a failed cloture vote, because of a filibuster. Now, I know this from personal experience because a judge named McConnell from Rhode Island was nominated by President Obama at the recommendation of the Rhode Island senators, and there were a number on this side who said we should filibuster the judge. I thought not. I argued to all of the Republicans that we never had done that in history and we ought not to do it and we ought not to start it. So what has happened? I believe, with all respect, the majority leader is manufacturing a crisis. There's no crisis with those 13 district judges. He's the one who could bring them up. He could have done it on Thursday, the day he changed the rules. Friday would be the intervening day. The maximum amount of debate that the Democrats could require on each of the judges would be 1 hour. So in 13 hours, before midnight tonight, they could all be district judges. And they were sitting on the calendar waiting for the majority leader to move. Now, the same is true with the sub-cabinet members. But let's just stay with the district judges for a minute, because if I know I'm right about this because I've sat down with a Senate historian. I sat down with the Congressional Research Service. I said, has there ever been a president's nominee of a federal district judge who's not been confirmed because of a failed cloture vote? And the answer is zero. Not for President Obama, not for President Bush, not for President Clinton, not for any president. And because Senator Reid, the distinguished majority leader, believed that the district judges were moving too slowly through the Senate, we changed the rules this past year. We said that with district judges, once there's a cloture vote, and remember, no judge has ever been denied his seat because of a cloture vote. Once there's a cloture vote, there can only be 2 hours of debate, one for the minority and one for the majority. So this is a manufactured crisis. That's what was done in order to do what the Democrat majority did on November 21st, which is the most stunning development in the history of the United States Senate in terms of a rules change. And I intend to talk about that tonight. And I want to go through some very specific facts, not speeches, not something made up, but facts. And I'm glad that the majority leader moved 4 district judges because every one of the other 9 might ask, well, Mr. Majority Leader, why did you not move my name? Why are you leaving me out? Because you could move it on Monday, wait a day, and on Wednesday you could confirm every single one of the judges there. The reason was because the majority leader wanted to make it look like there was a problem here, so he could do as Senator Levin said we did on November 21st over the objection of 48 senators. The Democratic majority established a precedent that the Senate can change the rules anytime it wants to, for any reason it wants to, which in effect creates a Senate without rules. So I want to speak a little bit tonight, Madam President, about how I and other senators are expected to serve in a Senate with no rules. Yesterday was a pretty exciting day in the National Football League. There were a lot of close games. The Ravens and the Vikings scored 5 touchdowns in 2 minutes and 1 second. And in Pittsburgh, Miami was ahead when the Steelers' Antonio Brown raced into the end zone after a series of lateral passes. One of those things where it's the last play of the game and they start throwing passes to each other. It rarely works. Every now and then it does. And it appeared to in this case because Brown was the last one with the ball. He got into the end zone before time expired, except the officials ruled he had stepped out of bounds before scoring. Now, Madam President, what if Pittsburgh had said yesterday, wait a minute, we're the home team, we'll change the rules and say if you step out of bounds only once as you're running toward the end zone with lateral passes on the last play of the game, then you score. So Pittsburgh wins the game. Or what if they'd said, we're the home team, we'll just add 5 minutes and see if we can win the game in that 5 minutes. They've been happy in Pittsburgh yesterday, but maybe not for a long time. But what happens when Miami becomes the home team and Pittsburgh goes to Miami to play and Miami changes the rules in the middle of the game so Miami can win? And what happens to the game of professional football if the home team could change the rules in the middle of the game to get the result it wants? The National Football League knows. They spend a lot of time on rules. They know if there is no integrity for the rules, there's no integrity for the game, and pretty soon the fans don't watch the game because the game has no integrity. That's why the NFL goes to such great lengths about its rules. There are officials all over the field. They're standing in the right in the middle of the play. There's an instant review of every call they make. When they make a call, they huddle to see if they interpreted the rule right. If a coach doesn't like it, he has an opportunity to challenge the rule. There's someone up in a box who looks at that and reviews it. Today, Monday morning, in New York, in the National Football League office, senior retired officials get together and they review every single call. and every single no call that was made yesterday in every league game. And they grade every single official based on those calls, and rarely does anyone get 100%. The NFL is in a constant review of the rules because if there's no integrity to the rules, they know there's no integrity to the game, there'll be no fans. I say this because on Thursday, the last day we're here, November 21st, before senators went home for Thanksgiving, the Democratic majority destroyed the rules of the United States Senate. With all of the Republican members opposed and 3 Democratic members opposed, the Senate voted 52-48 to invoke the so-called nuclear option, allowing a majority of senators present and voting, so not necessarily 51, to approve presidential nominees except for Supreme Court justices. For those positions, this eliminated the filibuster, which required 60 votes to proceed to an up or down majority vote. That's just what Senator Reid went through a few minutes ago. He was saying that we'll move for a cloture, we'll have an intervening day, then we'll have a cloture vote. Before Thursday, before November 21st, that took 60 votes. Although, as I said, in the case of federal district judges, it had never been used to deny a seat. But now it only takes a majority of those present and voting. This was the most dangerous restructuring of Senate rules since Thomas Jefferson wrote the rules, because it creates a perpetual opportunity for what Alexis de Tocqueville called, when he traveled our country in the 1830s, one of the greatest threats to our democracy, and that is the tyranny of the majority. This stunning rules change by the Senate majority can best be described as Obamacare 2. One of the things that Americans really didn't like about the new health care law, Obamacare, was that it was passed in the dead of night by a purely partisan vote during a snowstorm. It showed that those who had the votes could do whatever they want, no matter what the minority thought, and we can see the results. Millions of Americans having their policies canceled. Next year, tens of millions will, those who get their insurance through employers. Well, this is another example of that kind of power play. This time the goal was to help the administration and the Democratic majority advance its radical agenda unchecked through the courts and the executive agencies. As the senator from Michigan, Senator Levin, said, quoting a former Republican senator, Senator Vandenberg, Senator Levin is a Democrat, said on Thursday, quote, if a majority of the Senate can change its rules at any time, there are no rules. If a majority of the Senate can change its rule at any time, there are no rules. Just as if Pittsburgh, the home team, could change its rules at any time, there are no rules to the game. Every child knows that there have to be rules to the game. So I have this question. How am I and how are other senators supposed to serve in a United States Senate with no rules? How is this different from what could have happened in Pittsburgh if they'd changed the rules in the middle of the game? Or the Red Sox, finding themselves behind in the 9th inning, added a few innings just to make sure they beat the Cardinals in the World Series. In the Senate, future majorities could do whatever they want. End the filibuster for legislation, removing any obstacle to the tyranny of the majority. Just as if there were no integrity to the rules of football, there'd be no integrity to the game and there'd be no fans. If there's no integrity to the rules of the Senate, there's no integrity to the Senate and no respect for this part of our system of government. I think I was not overstating it when I said this is the most dangerous change to the rules since Thomas Jefferson wrote them. And when he did write the rules, Madam President, he had this to say about why we have rules. His words are in the Senate rule book that every single one of us has and hopefully have read at least the beginning parts of. This is at the very first, and it's worth reading. It's entitled by Jefferson, The Importance of Adhering to Rules. And remember, the argument here is not about the filibuster, it's about how the rule was changed, the importance of adhering to rules. And I'm going to read a little bit of this. According to Thomas Jefferson, when he wrote the Senate rules, Mr. Onslow, the ablest among the speakers of the House of Commons, used to say, it was a maxim he'd often heard when he was a young man from old and experienced members, that nothing tended to throw more power into the hands of administration and those who acted with the majority of the House of Commons than a neglect of or departure from the rules of proceeding. That these forms, as instituted by our ancestors, operated as a check and control on the actions of the majority, and that they were in many instances a shelter and a protection to the minority against the attempts of power. This is Thomas Jefferson writing about the importance of rules when he wrote the Senate rules. Continuing, so far the maxim is certainly true and is founded in good sense, that as it is always in the power of the majority by their numbers to stop any improper measures proposed on the part of their opponents, the only weapons by which the minority can be defended itself against similar attempts from those in power are the forms and rules of proceeding which have been adopted as they were found necessary from time to time and are become the law of the House, by a strict adherence to which the weaker party can only be protected from those irregularities and abuses which these forms were intended to check, and which the wantonness of power is but too often apt to suggest to large and successful majorities. I would think a majority that claims to protect the rights of minorities would be interested in these words of Jefferson, and especially in the following words. And whether these forms be in all cases the most rational or not is really not of great importance. It is much more material, Thomas Jefferson said, that there should be a rule to go by than what the rule is. It is much more material, Thomas Jefferson wrote, that there should be a rule to go by than what the rule is. That there should be a uniformity of proceeding in business, not the subject to the caprice of the Speaker or captiousness of the members. It is very material that order, decency, and regularity be preserved in a dignified public body. That was Thomas Jefferson on the importance of Senate rules when he wrote them at the beginning of our country, and the majority has set a precedent that destroys those rules, that destroys the integrity of the rules, because a Senate in which a majority can change the rules at any time for any reason is a Senate with no rules. That is why it is not too much to say, Madam President, that the Democratic majority has created a perpetual opportunity for the tyranny of the majority. The majority can do anything it wants, anytime it wants. In this case, what it wanted to do is stack the federal court. It hears most of the challenges to its radical regulatory agenda with judges who believe in that agenda. Who knows what the next power play will be? First, Obamacare. Then Obamacare 2, the change of the rules. But what we do know is that this majority has set an unprecedented precedent, that they have set the precedent to do whatever they want to do anytime they want to do it. They've created a Senate without rules. Now let's talk a little bit about what the justification might be for such a stunning action. Because there are so many words thrown around that don't represent facts at all, that somehow I wonder at this. For example, the Democrats complain their radical action was warranted because the Senate is broken. I agree with that, and I'll explain in a few minutes why I think so. But their reason is that President Obama's appointees have been unfairly denied seats by failed cloture votes or filibuster. The charge was, and you heard the majority leader just a few minutes ago, things have gotten so bad that this Republican majority has treated President Obama unfairly by denying his nominees their seats by failed cloture votes or filibusters. Madam President, the Democrats have gotten themselves in a room and convinced each other that this is true, but it is flat out not true. According to the Congressional Research Service, and I've researched this for several months, I've asked them this question: have there ever been any Supreme Court nominees by any president who've been denied his or her seat by a filibuster? The answer is no. It's zero. Now, there's one possible exception. Abe Fortas was nominated by President Lyndon Johnson as Chief Justice. The nomination was in trouble on both sides of the aisle, and to help his friend Abe Fortas save face, President Johnson engineered a cloture vote in 1968. I think the vote was 47 to 46. They call that a win to help, quote, Abe save face. But certainly, President Obama's nominees have not been denied their seats by a failed cloture vote. Neither has any other presidents. Have there ever been any cabinet members, Madam President, of President Obama or any other president who've been denied their seats by a failed cloture vote or by a filibuster? According to the Congressional Research Service, the answer is no. The number is 0. There have been no cabinet members who've been denied their seats in the Obama administration by a failed cloture vote. Have there ever been any district judges, federal district judges denied their seats by a failed cloture vote for President Obama or any other president? The answer is 0. The answer is 0. So, Supreme Court justices, with a Fortas exception, maybe. Cabinet members, federal district judges. Never in the history of President Obama and never in the history of this country have a president's nominations been denied by a filibuster. It's interesting. Then why did we go to this stunning radical move on November 21st? Well, maybe it was because of sub-cabinet members. How many of those have been denied their seats by a filibuster, according to the Congressional Research Service? 2 of President Obama's, 3 of President Clinton's, President Bush's, George W. Bush, and 2 of President Clinton's. That's a total of 7 in the history of the United States Senate, when a filibuster has said to a sub-cabinet member, we're going to deny you your seat because of a filibuster or a failed cloture vote. So President Obama has been treated about exactly the same as his last 2 predecessors. And in all of those I've just mentioned, we've only found among cabinet members, district judges, among Supreme Court justices and sub-cabinet members, 2 Obama nominees who've been denied their seats by a failed cloture vote. Now, that is a fact, Madam President. That is not a piece of Republican propaganda. That comes from the Congressional Research Service. So why is there a fuss about this? Well, maybe it's because of the federal circuit judges. Well, let's talk about that. As for appeals court judges, Republican filibusters have blocked 5. But when did that happen? That happened, Madam President, as a result of what happened in 2003, the year I came to the Senate. Then Democrats got together and said, we think Bush's nominees are too conservative, so for the first time in the history of the Senate, we're going to block 10 of President Bush's nominees, basically because they're too conservative. I knew some of these judges. I used to clerk on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal for Judge John Minor Wisdom. I knew the respect he had for Judge Pryor. I knew Mr. Pickering, who had really been a pioneer for civil rights in the state of Mississippi in the 60s and the 70s when it was hard to be. The truth was, the majority of Democrats said, we're going to block 10 of the Bush judges. Never been done before, but we're going to do it with a cloture vote. Well, Madam President, as you can guess, everyone on the Republican side in the majority then got very excited. And the majority leader, Senator Frist, said, we're going to change the rules, do something that Senator Lott, a majority leader, once said was the nuclear option. And there was great consternation. Senator Reid said, and he recounts this very well in his book, in 2006, he said, to do so would be the end of the Senate. I made 2 speeches, Madam President. I suggested, well, this is a terrible thing to do. A president ought to have an up or down vote on his circuit judges. So why don't we see if we can't get a few Republicans and a few Democrats and just take it out of the hands of the leaders and agree that we'll only use the filibuster on circuit judges in extraordinary circumstances, which is the result. So I had said at the time I would never vote for a filibuster on a circuit judge. I adjusted my view to be the same as the Senate precedent that came out of the Gang of 14. The 10 Bush judges, of those, 5 were not confirmed, 5 were confirmed. So in 2003, the Democratic senators, for the first time in history, refused to confirm 5 presidential nominees for the Federal Court of Appeals by cloture vote, by filibuster. And the expected happened. Over time, the Republicans now have blocked 5. So Republicans and Democrats are even. When you start something, things that have a way of coming back around. And what the Democrats said was a fair thing to do in 2003 and 4, the Republicans now say is a fair thing to do. If the Democrats think the Republican nominees are too conservative, they'll block 5 of them. And we'll say if we think the President Obama's nominees are too liberal, well, then we'll block 5 of them. And we put in the trash heap the tradition that we never use the filibuster on federal courts of appeals judges. Now, the majority leader and others have said, well, that's not the only problem. The problem is that President Obama has had to wait too long to get his judges confirmed. Again, that's not true either. It's not true either. This is another case that the Democrats apparently have gotten themselves in a room and convinced each other that something that isn't true is true. According to the Congressional Research Service, President Obama's second-term cabinet nominees have been confirmed at about the same pace as President Bush's cabinet nominees and President Clinton's cabinet nominees. I heard the majority leader say the other day, use the example of the distinguished Secretary of Defense, former member of this body, Senator Hagel, as an example of delay. Well, let me comment on that, if I may. Senator Hagel's nomination was reported to the Senate floor the day after it was reported by the Armed Services Committee. The majority leader filed cloture and called that a filibuster. Now, many Republican senators, I watched the senator from Arizona, the senator from South Carolina, and others say on the floor to the majority leader, that is premature. You're cutting off debate before we've had a chance to consider the Secretary of Defense of this country. And if you'll allow us more time, at that time we're going into the President's Day recess for a week, we'll cut off debate the day we come back, and then we'll have an up or down vote. But no. The majority leader in the White House said, ram it through. So they insisted on a vote. The vote was turned down. He calls that a filibuster. I call it cutting off debate prematurely. I mean, why in the world wouldn't you allow a Secretary of Defense to be on the floor for more than one day before you cut off the debate prematurely and call it a filibuster? The majority leader said, well, we could be attacked. I think he must have forgotten we had a perfectly adequate Secretary of Defense in place, Leon Panetta, until the next one was confirmed. And he was going to be confirmed because the Democrats had a majority of votes to do that, and a cabinet member had never been denied his or her seat because of a failed cloture vote. I want to keep coming back to that. A cabinet member has never been denied that. A cabinet member will be confirmed after a while, after you have questions. In that case, it was one day. Now, in my case, 20 years ago, when President Bush nominated me for the Education Secretary, and there was a Democratic Senate, I was announced in December, nominated in January, and it was March before some of the Democratic senators saw fit to give me a vote, and I was confirmed by unanimous consent. During that time, I tried to get ready for our education program, gave me some time to work. When President Reagan nominated Ed Meese to be the Attorney General, it took a year before the Senate confirmed Ed Meese, but it confirmed him. There have been some cabinet members who have withdrawn their names because they've become embarrassed or for some other reason. But if the question is, has a failed cloture vote ever been used to deny a cabinet member his or her seat? The answer is no. In the case of Secretary Hagel, I would think that one day is not quite long enough to file a motion to cut off debate and claim it's a filibuster. What about judges? Has the Senate been slow on judges? This year, the Senate has confirmed 36 of the President's second-term nominees to circuit and district courts, compared with 14 for President Bush at this point in his second term in 2005. These things are never exact because they're vacancies for a variety of reasons. That's a pretty big difference. Very hard to argue that it's unfair. But the majority leader did argue successfully that the minority was holding up district judges in order to negotiate for other points. He did that in the second time that a bipartisan group of us sat down to talk about how to change the Senate rules so we could move along better. And so what the Senate agreed to do earlier this year was to change the rules to make it easier to confirm district judges. Here's the procedure. Remember, first they have to be on the calendar. How do they get on the calendar? A committee majority puts them on the calendar. What party has a majority in the Judiciary Committee? The Judiciary Committee majority is Democratic. That puts them on the calendar. So Democrats put them on the calendar. Only the majority leader can take them off the calendar, and when he does that, he has no motion to proceed. He just takes them right off, just like he did tonight. And if he wants to, he can just bring them up and ask consent that they be approved, which they often are. I'm told by the Republican leader's office that when the majority leader rammed the rules change through on November 21st, there were about 40 or so non-controversial so-called nominees who were about to be confirmed, including many district judges. But tonight, the majority leader has selected 4 of the 13 district judges that are on the calendar and made a big show out of the fact that we're going to take an intervening day tomorrow and then we're going to vote on them, I guess, beginning on Wednesday. Well, under the rules change that he asked for, the debate on each one of those can only be 2 hours, and it's divided evenly, which means the Democrats have an hour and the Republicans have an hour. If the Democrats want to speed things up, they can give their hour back. On a non-controversial judge, Republicans normally wouldn't say anything except a word or two of praise. But let's say the Republicans are upset by the rules change and were to say, we'll take that whole hour. The Democrats could say 2 or 3 minutes of praise for the district judge, and we could confirm those 4 in 4 hours. I mean, that's half a day's work. And the question I asked the majority leader was, what about the other 9? What about the other 9 district judges who are sitting on this calendar, put there by the Democratic majority in the Judiciary Committee? Only one person in the United States Senate can bring them up for a vote, and he didn't bring them up. Why doesn't he bring them up? He could bring them up today. Tomorrow would be the intervening day. We could vote on Wednesday and vote them all. He could have brought every single district judge up on last Thursday when he turned the Senate into a place that has no rules. Friday would have been the intervening day, and we could have been voting all day today, and by the time we went home for supper, every single district judge would be confirmed because of the rules change. The only reason I can see to go through all this is to manufacture a crisis to make the American people think that somehow the minority is abusing its privileges. I read the executive calendar on November 21st very carefully. Remember, this is the document that's on every senator's desk. You have to be on here in order to be confirmed. If you're an executive nominee, the only person who can bring you up is the majority leader. Same with a legislative. So these are legislative matters require a motion of consent. There were only 16 on the calendar who had been there 3 weeks, and only 8 more who had been there more than 9 weeks, and 2 of the 8 were being held up by Democratic senators. That's hardly a crisis. Now, finally, let me address the claim that the majority leader just didn't take seriously that Republicans have unfairly blocked the president from filling vacancies on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. Remember, I pointed out that the Democrats started this by saying that if President Bush nominates judges that are too conservative, we'll block them, and so the Republicans now have blocked an equal number of President Obama's judges. But that's not the primary reason for blocking it. The primary reason is stated in a letter written on July 27, 2006, to the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, a Republican, Senator Specter, from all of the Democratic members of the Judiciary Committee. President Bush had nominated someone for this same court, the District of Columbia Federal Court, and this is what the Democratic senators said in 2006. We believe that Mr. Kiesler should under no circumstances be considered, much less confirmed, by this committee before we address the very need for that judgeship, receive and review necessary information about the nominee, and deal with the genuine judicial emergencies identified by the Judicial Conference. In other words, what the Democrats were saying, and it included a number of the most distinguished members of this body, the chairman, Senator Leahy, Senator Schumer, Senator Feingold, Senator Feinstein, Senator Cole, Senator Kennedy, Senator Durbin, Senator Biden, they were saying that this court, the D.C. court, is an important court, but its workload is half the national average of all the courts. It doesn't need any more judges. And before we add any more judges to a court that's underworked, we ought to consider transferring those judgeships to courts that are overworked. That argument had been made since 2001 by Senator Grassley, the senator from Iowa. And finally, with some bipartisan cooperation in 2007, he achieved some success. With President Bush's agreement, the Republican president, he agreed with the Democratic senators that the D.C. Circuit should under no circumstances, that's their words in their letter, have more judges. They reduced it by one, the number of judges, and they transferred a judge to the Ninth Circuit, which was overworked. So all Republicans have said about the three judges who the president has nominated to the D.C. Circuit is, before we consider any of them, consider Senator Grassley's bill. Do in 2013 what you said we should do in 26 and 7, and which we did in a bipartisan way. So how can you dismiss this when Republicans are asking to do in 2013 exactly what the Democrats successfully insisted on in 2006, which is to transfer judges from the courts where they're not needed to the courts where they are needed. In fact, the D.C. Circuit has a lower caseload by comparison today than it did in 2007 when, by bipartisan agreement, it was considered underworked. The Democrats didn't think it was unfair then to insist that we not appoint more judges to a court that was underworked. It must be they're trying to manufacture a crisis now. So if there's no good reason, to change the rules in such a dramatic way as the majority did on November 21, why would the majority leader insist on cramming through in a power play a rules change that in 2006 he said would be the end of the Senate? Because the vote, Madam President, was not about the filibuster. All of that is pretext. The vote was about allowing the majority to do whatever it wants to do anytime it wants to do it. One of the things the American people detested about Obamacare, as I said earlier, was that it was crammed through in the middle of the night in a partisan power play, and you can see the results. Unlike the Civil Rights Bill, which had a broad bipartisan support, I can remember Senator Dirksen and President Johnson working together on it when it required 67 votes in the Senate. And because it achieved that consensus, Senator Russell went home, the great opponent of the bill, to Georgia and said it's the law of the land, we should now support it. When you cram through a big social change, or any big change through the Congress, you're going to get the kind of result you get with Obamacare today. Millions of people losing their policies, tens of millions will next year, great concern, website not working, That's what you get when you cram things through in a partisan way, and the Democrats have done it again. So if the filibuster was not the problem, then why is the Senate not functioning better? Why are we so low in public opinion polls? Frankly, Madam President, it's because of the Senate leadership. I've had the privilege over the years of watching the United States Senate. I came here for the first time in 1967 as an aide to Senator Howard Baker, the future majority leader of the Senate. I watched Senator Mansfield and Senator Dirksen. I watched Senator Byrd and Senator Baker. I watched Senator Daschle, Senator Lott, Senator Frist. I wasn't in the Senate all that time. I've only been here since 2003, but I've seen it over that time up close. All of them could operate this body very well under the rules we had until Thursday of 2 weeks ago, until November 21st. I was at the Rules Committee meeting when Senator Byrd, the former majority leader and acknowledged as the great historian of the Senate, came. He could barely speak, but he had one last message for the Senate, and it was, don't change the filibuster. He called it the necessary fence against the excesses of the executive and the popular will. That was what Senator Byrd said. And he also said that under the rules we had until November 21st, that a majority leader could operate the Senate if he wanted to. The current majority leader seems to be unable to do that. And we saw an example of it here tonight. He brings up 4 district judges while there are 13 on the calendar. He could have brought them up on November 21st. We could have been voting on all of them today. He could bring them all up today and we could vote on all of them Wednesday, but he's parceling them out as if there were a crisis somewhere. Why is he doing that? I don't see why he is doing that. It's not the way to make the Senate function. It's not what Senator Byrd would do. It's not what Senator Baker would do. I saw them come in and open up the Senate to amendments, put a bill on the floor, ask for amendments. Here came 300 amendments. Asked for unanimous consent to cut off amendments. They got unanimous consent because nobody could think of any other amendments. And then Senator Byrd would say, and Senator Baker did as well, all right, let's start voting. And vote. When we get to about Wednesday or Thursday, senators would think, well, maybe my amendment's not so important. And by Friday, when it was clear that the majority leader was going to finish the bill this week, they dropped the amendment, and we got it done. So the Senate was a place, not perfect. Things were still bumpy. There was Senator Mensenbaum sitting on the front row objecting. There was Senator Williams before him, Senator Allen before him, exercising their rights. But the majority leader was able to do that. The Senate worked on Mondays. It worked on Fridays, worked at night. And the threat of that usually caused people who were trying to not show a proper amount of restraint in the use of their privileges to back down. Instead, what the current majority leader does, and you heard him tonight, he complains about obstructionism when there isn't any. Certainly not on nominations. We're only talking about nominations here tonight. And I'm not going to say that senators on both sides of the aisle haven't abused their privileges and slowed the Senate down. But he complains about obstructionism when in fact he's become the obstructionist in chief by making it more difficult for those of us who are elected from our states to represent the people who have a right to be heard. 77 times this majority leader has cut off amendments in a body whose whole purpose is to amend, debate, and vote. I call it a gag rule, with the majority cutting off the right of American voices to be heard on the Senate floor. 114 times he's filed a motion to cut off debate on the same day he's introduced a bill, and he calls that a filibuster. I call it a gag rule. He's bypassed Senate committees in an unprecedented way, 76 times in the last 6 years. He set himself up as the king of the Senate. May I offer an amendment on Iran, the senator might ask. No. May I offer an amendment on Egypt? No. How about an amendment on Obamacare? What about a bill on the National Labor Relations Board? No. Can we work on appropriations bills? No. Only one person deciding what happens here, when in fact the history of the Senate has been a place of virtually unlimited debate on virtually any amendment. That's been the history of the United States Senate. It's different than the House of Representatives. It has been different than every other body in the world. It operates by unanimous consent, and it requires restraint which hasn't always been given. But majority leaders who have been effective have found their way to deal with that. And I've spent the last 3 years doing my best to work on helping to make this place function. I cannot say, Madam President, where this rules change on November 21 will lead, but it is heading in a dangerous direction, a direction that is dangerous for the Senate and dangerous for our country. This is a country that prizes the rule of law. Other countries around the world that don't have it wish they were here, wish they had a country with the rule of law. So in a country that prizes the rule of law, we now have a Senate without any rules, because the Senate majority has decided for the first time that a majority can change the rules at any time for any reason it wants, which makes this a body without rules. In a country that yearns for solutions on Iran, on health care, on our debt crisis, we have a king of the Senate saying no amendments, no debate, I'll make all the decisions. I know of only one cure for this dangerous trend, Madam President, and that is one word: an election. The election of 6 new Republican senators so that power plays like Obamacare and the November 21st rules change will be ended, and the Senate will again be alive with bills, amendments, and debates reflecting the will of the American people on the important issues of our time. Madam President, I ask consent to include in the record the letter from the year 2006 from senators, the Democratic senators on the Judiciary Committee, saying that there should be no new judges added to the D.C. Court of Appeals because it's underworked.
Without objection.
And Madam President, I yield the floor.
The Senate stands adjourned.